live in New York City. I'm the UN NGO representative for the Society of the Sacred Heart here in New York. And I'm originally from Canada and really enjoyed Thanksgiving here, even though it was a little played down, I think, from usual. But yeah, I'm just very happy to be here tonight.
And I'm Mary Finlayson. I'm also a Canadian RSCJ, Religious of the Sacred Heart. My service, my ministry is as Vocation Director for the United States Canada Province. And I'm happy to be here with you. Can't believe it's the last day of November. Tomorrow we're into December. Here we are in Advent. It's good to be together. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Mary. And just, I guess, one more note for anybody else that's new about me. I am a lay Catholic woman. I'm based in New York City, and I am a member of the parish of St. Francis Xavier. And I have the privilege of being connected to my two co-organizers by virtue of being a colleague of Sheila's, because we both work among religious NGOs who are representing the faith-based mission for justice and peace in human rights advocacy spaces at the UN. And so that was how this connection is born, but we're taking it into a different realm with this series. So once again, thank you all for being here. And we will now really get started with an opening prayer or poem, which, if you were able to take a look at the reflection and reading prompt before getting on the call this evening, you'll recognize it as the poem on hope from the bottom of the selected readings from Barbara Kingsolver. And so I'm going to share my screen and invite Sheila and Mary to help lead us in this prayer.
Look, you might as well know. This thing is going to take endless repair. Rubber bands, crazy glue, tapioca, the square of the hypotenuse, 19th century novels, heartstrings, sunrise, all of these are useful. Also feathers. To keep it humming, sometimes you have to stand on an incline where everything looks possible, on the line you drew yourself, or in the grocery line, making faces at a toddler secretly over his mother's shoulder. You might have to pop the clutch and run past all the evidence, past everyone who is laughing or praying for you. Definitely, you don't want to go directly to jail, but still, here you go, passing time, passing strange. Don't pass this up.
In the worst of times, you will have to pass it off, park it, and fly by the seat of your pants. With nothing in the bank, you'll still want to take the express. Tiptoe past the dogs of the apocalypse that are sleeping in the shade of your future. Pay at the window. Pass your hope like a bad check. You might still have just enough time to make a deposit.
Thank you both. So we selected that as the opening, both the prompt and opening prayer for tonight, because we are focusing our discussion tonight overall on the theme of hope, and particularly the great challenge of looking for hope in the natural world, the natural environment around us, at a season where the signs of the season seem to more obviously be shouting despair, stark, dormancy, stagnation, a lack of growth, lack of greenery, lack of new life. And so the challenge is great to find these important virtues and values that drive us and motivate us as humans. And we have to do a bit more work to find them in this part of the year and in this difficult, broader context that we're all dealing with, living in the midst of an ongoing pandemic that in some ways has made it feel like winter long before its time. And so as we head into winter upon winter, the search becomes extra challenging to cultivate this virtue of hope and kind of keep our own internal flames lit to make it to that season that's so easy to love and where hope is so abundant and examples are abounding all around us in nature. And so with that, I will first offer a brief kind of review. I'm going to pick out some of the key lines from our reading prompt, especially just in case anyone wasn't able to take a look at it beforehand, to give a sense of what we're talking about in this particular discussion when we talk about hope. And I found that I particularly loved the perspective offered by Barbara Kingsolver, who wrote that poem that we opened with, who describes for herself, she sees a distinction between optimism, pessimism, and hope, 3 separate things. She says, the pessimist would say, it's going to be a terrible winter, we're all going to die. The optimist would say, oh, it'll be all right, I don't think it'll be that bad. And the hopeful person would say, maybe someone will still be alive in February, so I'm gonna put some potatoes in the root cellar just in case. And so in this way, Barbara paints for us a very active vision of hope. She says it's not a state of mind, but something we actually do with our hearts and our hands, which I think is a key piece of the puzzle. To navigate ourselves through difficult passages in life. So it's not, hope is not in the sitting on your hands and wishing, but it is in the construction of the future that you wish to see and making all preparations possible for that future to be realized. And further on from our other reading, which is from a commencement address that Barbara Kingsolver offered in 2008. She says many wonderful things that I encourage you to take a look at when you get a chance if you haven't already. But probably the key piece for our purposes is we've done hard things before. The hardest part will be to convince yourself of the possibilities and hang on. If you run out of hope at the end of the day, to rise in the morning and put it on again with your shoes. Hope is the only reason you won't give in, burn what's left of your ship and go down with it. You have to love so earnestly, you who are born into the age of irony. Imagine getting caught with your optimism hanging out. It feels risky. You may feel you're not up to the task, but know that you can be as earnest and ridiculous as you need to be if you don't attempt it in isolation. The ridiculously earnest are known to travel in groups, and they are known to change the world. Look at you. That could be you. And so it's in that context, in that image and idea of an active hope, a radical hope, sometimes swimming upstream to get to the future you imagine, kind of a hope, that I sort of framed my own reflection in preparation to kind of get the ball rolling. And I will say, just to give a heads up and a fair warning, I will later in the discussion in our time together, I will kind of open the floor and invite people to offer their own observations about where you have been seeing or finding hope in the natural world around you in this season, and it doesn't need to be a fully formed conclusion or a thesis of any kind, but if there's some particular phenomenon or some particular piece of nature that is inspiring you or drawing you into further conversation and curiosity, where you think maybe there's some kernel of hope being revealed, you can start to begin thinking about that now and consider whether or not you might like to share it. And I will get the ball rolling by offering a couple of the places that I have been seeing the strongest signs of hope in nature. And another warning I'll give before I dive into my examples is that even further on in our time together, I will ask you to engage in a little reflective activity for which you will need 2 small pieces of paper and some kind of writing implement. So if you have something handy, fantastic. If not, truly any scrap of paper will do. It doesn't need to be big. If you're like me, maybe you have a severely underused 2020 planner with lots of empty pages. That might do the trick. And you might end up reworking this little reflection many times. So don't worry too much about the nature of the paper. But that being said, keep that in your mind. You'll need that later on. And I will now kind of get the ball rolling on our sharing by offering these 2 places that I'm seeing hope in nature around me. And the first one, in a very strong way, is in autumn, the opportunity that we get to bear witness to hope that's exhibited by vivacious trees that are willingly casting off their leaves. And before they do that, they're putting on a show of strength, full of glory that's just on full display. And though we're humans observing this drama, we often thoughtlessly describe the leafless tree after this grand display as dead. It's a common instinctive thing. I've caught myself saying it many times, the dead trees in winter. But when you think about it, of course, the autumnal display that we're witnessing is not a swan song of any kind. The tree does not think that it's dying in the midst of this display of grandeur, and it's not bidding us farewell. It's not laying down for a long nap even. On the contrary, the tree knows that its fall foliage is simply a prelude, a raising of the curtain for the real show of magnificence that is to follow. It's shouting to us when it's turning into its bright, warm, and hot colors that capture our attention and kind of just raise the stakes of the big gamble that it's about to take, which is when it really puts its full power on display. Because then we've all had our eyes drawn in its direction. Everyone's attention is turned toward the grand beauty of the tree. And it's just at that moment when our expectations and our admiration are at their very peak that the tree does something that's really audacious when you think about it. It willingly relinquishes all of the beautiful foliage that elicited so much praise from its human neighbors, and even kind of does so playfully. We witness through the dancing way that each leaf kind of departs from the tree and makes its way to the ground. It's a very casual way of expressing. The tree is saying, in a sense, I am so much more than my leaves. I am the leaf creator and curator. I have a share in eternity because I understand my share in impermanence. And let me unpack that a little, because some of those words are kind of dense. But when I say I understand I have a share in eternity because I understand my share in impermanence, I think there's a big lesson being offered to us about hope by this phenomenon of the losing of the leaves. I think the trees in winter can remind us that the noise and the fanfare that we use to busy and adorn ourselves throughout most of the rest of the year are not really our essence, but rather temporary expressions of who we are that are meant only for a season. And the trees remind us that creation is an ongoing act in which we are participants. As such, it would be to our great peril to cling in the coming year to the foliage that served us in the last year. The trees remind us that we are all at the same time both eternal and temporary. We exist in perpetuity as long as we don't insist on being perpetually exactly as we are right now. And our educator, the tree, also says that when the wind is whipping at its bitterest, turn your gaze to your internal life. Tend to your permanent nature. Name what it is about you that is temporary and release it. And this work of turning inward and tending to the inward is the stuff that hope is made of, in my view. It is the practice of creatures who believe somewhere in either their roots or their bones that a new season and a new reality will arrive, and it will be set in motion and sustained by the pieces of yesterday and today that we choose to relinquish. And it will be sustained by those pieces that we allow to replenish the soil underneath our feet rather than holding on to them with two hands. And as an interesting aside, when I was exploring this whole line of thinking, I was pretty amused. I was struck by the similarity between the words deciduous, meaning, of course, all the trees that go through this phenomenon of losing their leaves every year, and the word decide, choosing, discerning between what to keep and what to let go. And I looked into it, and I was amused to learn that the words deciduous and decide actually have kind of tangled roots in a Latin word that can be used to mean either to decide or to fall. And so now, knowing of that link, I will forever think of deciduous trees, not only as ones that drop their leaves each year, but also as the trees that decide. And they decide in favor of the future by celebrating and then relinquishing the present. And maybe it's by linguistic accident, but I am charmed by that connection between the words for deciduous and decide. And will now be viewing this drama in this way, I think, for a long time and contemplating that. And the second sign of hope that I'm seeing in nature, and I promise I will offer this one much more succinctly, is that of the bulb, the hardy bulbs, the early spring blooming bulbs that we plant in the ground. I've known since childhood that many of my favorite springtime flowers, the ones that let us know that spring's really here, which are the crocuses, the daffodils, the tulips, the irises, all of those come from bulbs that have to be planted in the fall before the first frost hardens the ground. And when I was preparing for this season of darkness and what we might talk about in this discussion series, I, for the first time, really dug into why it is that these bulbs need to be planted before the winter and then have to struggle through this difficult, dark weather, frozen ground. Why wouldn't we just wait and plant them later when conditions are more favorable, you would think, for living things to take root and to sprout. But I learned upon even brief research that it's not simply because the ground is too hard in midwinter that we plant these bulbs in the fall. But as it turns out, the spring flowering bulbs actually need to spend about 3 months in the dark, in the cold, in the sometimes frozen earth in order to activate the biochemical process that eventually culminates in the sprouting of these flowers that we know and love. And cold temperatures actually do that by triggering starches in the bulbs that break down into glucose or sugar and other small molecules. And in addition to these glucose molecules serving as a food supply for the bulb while it's camping out underground during the winter, the glucose is actually interacting with other small molecules in this kind of a similar way to how salt interacts with water on a frozen sidewalk to help lower the temperature at which the water will freeze. And all of that to say that this same kind of glucose water interaction in the bulb underground when the ground is freezing actually helps keep the bulbs warm and safe and snug in their winter beds. And what's even more interesting to me is that a harsh winter with lots of snow actually helps the bulbs emerge even bigger and hardier than a mild winter, because the snow acts as an actual warming blanket against all odds. And it also typically leads to kind of this perfect, slow melting absorption of water into the soil at kind of just the perfect rate for the bulbs to take it in and make use of it. And I found myself very fascinated with this concept. Apart from being in awe of the craftiness of the biochemistry and how it both feeds the plant and keeps the frost away, I can see lessons, again, as I did with the tree, lessons in the bulb for us. I started thinking of it as the gospel according to the spring flowering bulbs, which is that the main lesson that I draw from it is that every season is a season of growth. Even when we are 6 inches under in the eyes of the world, which is the typical depth for planting most bulbs, somewhere between 4 and 6 inches. Living creatures have capacities for adaptation, innovation, and growth that can only be unlocked through time spent in solitude, darkness, and quiet. We're very cleverly made, like the bulbs. We have unseen stores of energy that we can only begin to tap into in the absence of sweet, consoling sunlight. And in the hardy bulb story, as in the deciduous tree story, we're told that our most important growth and innovation actually takes place below the surface in times that the untrained eye views as stagnation. This is the season for the inner work of hope. But that's not the bulb's only lesson. In my view, another way of looking at the bulb story is from the planter's perspective. From this angle, the bulb invites us again to the work of hope by asking us to envision the season to come and to decide what new growth we want to see in the future time. What relationships or skills or habits should inhabit our springtime? The bulb tells us, plant now. The time for blooming might appear to be really far off, and the blossoming relationship that we hope to have somewhere down the road, right now it might just look like a hard, tiny, tiny onion. That is indeed how most bulbs look before they go in the ground. Nothing much to look at, nothing impressive, no appealing colors, nothing like what we anticipate seeing emerge from them months later. But spring is made of these tiny, hard onions. It's made of investing thought and intention up front, sustaining commitment to them while changing course as necessary through times of challenge. The first fruits of spring are made in the work of autumn vision and winter hope. So those are my 2 examples to get us going. I would now like to open the floor and invite if anyone wants to share your thoughts. You can begin with any of the reflection questions that were placed on the reading prompt for tonight's discussion with regard to Barbara Kingsolver's portrayal of hope. You can talk about where you are finding your own signs and observations of hope in nature. If by chance you happen to also be ruminating on the falling of the leaves from the tree or you're ruminating on flowering bulbs, I apologize for having said so much on the subject, but I hope you'll consider sharing your perspective regardless, because I'm sure that mine could use some fleshing out and some enlightenment. And there are certainly as many angles to any theme as there are people present in the group. And again, anything that you share here, it doesn't need to be a fully formed reflection, but if you have any kernel or seed or starting point of an idea or an observation where you're starting to see hope or getting curious about hope, or you're just feeling something shimmering or sparking curiosity, I hope you'll consider sharing it with the other kind souls here who will be nothing but receptive to your vision and your observations. And you may not know each other, but do your best to trust that you're certainly among friends here. So with that, you are fully free to, if you want, you can either put a note in the chat box if you want to share something. You can wave a hand, or if we're not all jumping in at once, then you can also just unmute yourself and speak. It's a very manageable number of people here. But we'll just take a pause now if anyone would like to share your own reflections.
Hey, Teresa, I'll start.
Great, thanks.
So I read something the other day. I know folks are all over here, but for those of us in the Pennsylvania, Philly area, the most popular activity this summer was, of course, spotted lanternfly stomping. And I recently saw, I can put the little article in the chat for folks. So apparently there was this new honey that appeared this year. And when they dug into how this new honey with its different flavor came about, they realized that these trees that this invasive species, the spotted lanternfly, really love, because they've been eating into these trees, the bees, I guess, can get to the honey or get to the nectar more easily. And they've been creating this new interesting flavor. So just the article I read was this commentary on, hey, like these invasive species that, you know, folks can't manage to control. There's no, you know, end in sight for it, but there's this beautiful new honey. So again, yeah, I just thought it's just an example of nature working in interesting ways.
Awesome, thank you. I was amazed to learn that those lanternflies stayed so concentrated. They were a huge phenomenon in the Philadelphia area, but I didn't spot a single one in New York City, so.
Thank goodness our stomping worked well.
But that's another, actually, thinking on, you know, how winter helps us out. Invasive species don't fare well in climates where they don't belong, so that's another helper for us all. Does anyone else have an idea, an observation, response to anything you heard either here or in the Kingsolver reading?
I'll go for it.
Great. Thanks, Rachel.
So where I live, there's kind of two types, I guess, of animals. Some that kind of migrate and some that really kind of stay and hunker down and are gathering food, particularly squirrels right now. And it's very much reminds me of, like, they're gathering their nuts, their acorns, they're kind of really preparing themselves for what they know will be. Winter's not always friendly, right? We don't always enjoy it, even though we get to spend most of our time inside, but they're out there 24/7. So kind of that gathering of with the essential kind of that you touched upon, and not fleeing, but kind of staying and preparing.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to share? What is sparking your curiosity in nature? Yes, Miranda.
Hi, everyone. I have been finding a lot of hope taking walks in my neighborhood. I'm in Connecticut at the moment. And I find a lot of relief actually being in a scene where there are no more leaves, where things are just like calm down. And I feel this like relief of this like pressure to enjoy myself, or like the pressure for everything to be like big and abundant, and like there's like a lot going on, you know, in the fall and the summer and the spring. And I find this a very calming time of year. And I think that this is one of my favorite times of year for just the kind of companionship of simplicity when I go outside. And I find taking walks to be very soothing in this particular environment.
Great. Thanks, Miranda.
I could follow on that.
Please.
One of the things that I have been noticing in my walks to Central Park is the smell of the leaves that have fallen. And there's something to me that's so comforting about the smell of fall leaves that have fallen. It takes me to my childhood, for one thing, because I just remember playing in the leaves. And when I was a kid, we used to go around and ask all the neighbors if we could rake their leaves so that we could get a big pile of leaves to jump in, which, you know, I'm not so sure that my parents were so happy with that, but we had all the leaves on our lawn. But it reminds me of when I was living with a native tribe, Indigenous people in Canada, in a part of British Columbia where the salmon run would go through their territory. And it was at the end of the salmon run where the salmon would spawn. And then, of course, they die. And I just remember this one elder one time saying, when she heard somebody talk about how much the fish stunk, basically, if you go down to the river, it really stunk. And she said, no, that's a sacred smell. And from that time on, whenever I, smelt that smell, I thought of her words about the sacredness of the smell of the fish who had just given their life for the next generation. And so that's what kind of tweaked my joy at these leaves that I was, purposely going off the path to shuffle through these leaves to hear them and to smell them, because it's a sacred smell when, because it's a sacred activity, as you described, Teresa, of that cycle of life, that there's new growth is happening as the old lets go. And so I just share about my sacred smell.
Thanks, Sheila. And think of all the joy, the immediate joy that emerges from, the tree's decision to relinquish those leaves. It immediately becomes joy for you as a child playing in it, and now remembering that and that time of hope, like you have nothing but hope and nothing but future when you're a child. Nothing else would ever occur to you, and so that's still present there, the sentiment and the connection of it all. And certainly talking about hope as swimming upstream, there's no better example of that than the salmon, so that's perfect. Anyone else have a nature observation, hope in nature?
Well, one thing I want to add is that you look out my window and it's dark, and it's not really cold, for typical New Jersey, but it's dark early. But I look out Nora's window and I see the sunlight, and I have hope that I will see the sun again, that it won't always be this dark this early.
That's right. And it's the equal reminder. I don't think we have anyone from the Southern Hemisphere on here, but reminds us, there was news today about record heat in Australia. So there's also that phenomenon to remember. This is always, there's always reciprocity in all of this routine change. Cecily.
I was actually going to say the same thing because I've been reflecting. So my colleague boss is in Australia. Just talked to her today, and we were talking about how it's fall here. Things are falling to the ground, dying, decomposing, so that they can give nutrition and new life in the spring. And in Australia, it's spring. Things are light. They've come out of their dark winter and are now enjoying beach time and summer. And so it kind of reminds me that we hold this duality all the time, that there's death that kind of cycles into life. And it reminded me of kind of a couple of the points that Mary Forlick said last week, that in moments of crisis, those are the moments that can lead to creativity and change. I also, these aren't my thoughts, but when I was reading Barbara Kingsolver, I was very deeply reminded of Rebecca Solnit's essays in the book called Hope in the Dark. And so I broke it out, and I just wanted to share a couple of the things. One also has to do with darkness. The beginning, she says, Virginia Woolf wrote in her journal, quote, "The future is dark, which is on the whole the best thing the future can be, I think." Dark, she seems to be saying, as an inscrutable, not as in terrible. We often mistake one for the other, or we transform the future's unknowability into something certain, the fulfillment of all our dread, the place beyond which there is no way forward. But again and again, far stranger things happen than the end of the world. And she also talks about hope as action, and talks about hope kind of contrasted with optimism and pessimism. I think she says optimists think it will all be fine without our involvement. Pessimists take the opposite position. Both excuse themselves from acting. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable, an alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact, are not things you can know beforehand. You may not, in fact, know them afterward either, but they matter all the same, and history is full of people whose influence was most powerful after they were gone. And she goes on and on and on. I really recommend her book. I had read it a few years ago, but broke it out again at the beginning of the pandemic when I was searching for words of hope and encouragement. And she talks about the importance of hope and advocacy, which is what I'm all about these days. So just wanted to share those.
Cecily, can you put the name of the book in the chat?
Yeah, I will.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yes, for sure. Tons of people want to know that. I am familiar with her, but I've never, I think I've only read pieces of that. So now I'm very, very eager to do so. Thank you so much for pulling those out for us. Yes, Mary Finlayson.
I was fortunate recently in November to make some retreat days at a cottage in upstate New York, and it was so peaceful and so quiet, and so bare of leaves, those same leaves, except for the geese. And on the lake in front of our cottage, there were hundreds of geese each day. Well, each afternoon arrived and settled overnight. And I learned later that at night, one of the geese stays awake to watch out over the others. And you hear him occasionally, or her honk, honk during the night. But then in the morning at dawn, they're munching away, you know, in the water, and they start self-organizing in beautiful ways. After days and days of this, I could listen to the sounds of what the geese were saying kind of to each other in the way they were honking to self-organize, to get ready to take off. And then they kind of form into lines, and it just, some of these geese were little. They were little fluffy gray balls, and I thought, well, my goodness, how far can they migrate? But they were doing it together. I think it was the migration together that struck me like never before. And they would sort of get into a pattern, and then all of a sudden lift off, 20 of them all together into the air and be gone. And that was that. And I did a little research, and I read that actually they think now some of the geese sleep while they fly in the V formation, that because of the airflow, that some of them can actually sleep and then take turns. And that the honking that you hear is because they're encouraging the goose at the front to keep going, because that's the hardest position. And so just all of that really spoke to me of community, That for me, hope is in helping each other to move into the future and being together in our hoping. The other thing we did was to pray at dawn any number of days and use Teilhard de Chardin's Mass on the World, you know, where he says, I have no paten, I have no chalice, but the whole earth is my altar this morning. And watching the sunrise over the hills in the distance. And what came to me after some days was, it's dawn somewhere all the time. All the time. There's new day, new life. So that retreat was a real gift, and at the end really called me to say, well, how do you bring that back to the city? How do you live in the middle of Manhattan and know, even though I can't see the dawn rise, I know it's rising. I know the sun is rising somewhere right now, everywhere, for a new day.
Thanks, Mary. And that idea of working together, hoping together, reminds me so much of Kingsolver's word in the commencement speech too, when she says, you know, that you can really be quite ridiculous in your ambitions, your ideas of what you can accomplish if you don't plan on doing it by yourself. And certainly when you think about the feat of migration that geese accomplish on a regular basis, it's completely ridiculous ambition that humans would never, you know, dream of doing a comparable distance on foot on a regular basis. But everything is changed by this idea of working in formation and getting organized. And we have so many ways to do that because we have our honking language too. Would anyone else like to share an experience or observation of hope from the natural world around you? Go ahead, Aunt Peggy.
This is kind of ties in with some of the things that people have already said, and talking about the leaves made me think of it. But you know, this spring my son started a compost bin, and you know, made a huge bin in the yard. And you know, I think of all the scraps that we think of as dead and lifeless, and we save them and we put them in this big bin and throw in the dead leaves and the dead, you know, duff of the earth. And it's time and it's darkness, and you know, stirring it up once in a while that, you know, makes something come that's new and very useful, and leads to new growth, new life. So just thinking of that. And
Great, thank you. Yeah, and certainly it's the only thing that allows us to keep growing the new stuff compost will be made of. So, but stirring, I like the idea of stirring the darkness, which is kind of was an idea that was in a way presented by Mary Froelich last week, talking about kind of just going out and being in the darkness and seeing it as brilliant, brilliant darkness, and not shying away from that, or finding it fearful or uncomfortable, or just noticing if we find it fearful or uncomfortable, and learning to make peace with it, learning from ourselves how we feel in that moment. Would anyone else like to share an experience or observation? Nora.
I would like to share that since I'm in Portland in the Northwest, the fall and impending winter also brings the rainy season here. And so there's a lot of people who are lamenting like, oh, it's getting rainy, and what that means for adjusting plans and sort of hunkering down inside with that additional barrier to experiencing nature. But something that I've sort of been trying to work on and reframing that experience of, rather than being like, oh, it's raining again, is to think about how important that water is to life. And the reason that I love this part of the country so much is because it is so lush, and the old growth trees are so beautiful to me. But that rainfall is what makes that possible, and that's the nourishment for all of this beauty. And so now when it's raining, rather than, you know, my gut reaction is to think, oh, again, but instead I often now say aloud, like, oh, it's raining, God is nourishing us again, as a way to think about all of the beauty that is to come from that nourishment, how important that process is to experience the fullness of the beauty here.
Thanks. And as I mentioned about the snow before too, I think typically, though it's been less and less because we're not seeing as much snowfall in winter, but typically winter is the season in this part of the or general latitude in which the water tables, the underground stores of water, get their most recharged is during this time, because the snow allows for that slow seeping and filtering through the soil. And so again, that's, you know, thinking of investing now for later, kind of a concept, doing work now, so that spring can actually exist again, and just going about it in a dutiful way and learning to appreciate, again, this idea of spring being made of winter, that it wouldn't happen without winter. It could not have perpetual spring. That would be the last spring we had if we didn't have a winter in between. Anyone else? Thought, inspiration, observation? Well, thank you all very much for your sharing and your many examples. It's been exciting to hear how many different ideas were at play. We can certainly all use each other's support in coming up with them, because it's definitely harder work this time of year to see the hope around us. But as we've exchanged tonight, it's very much there, in some ways in almost a deeper and more meaningful way than when it kind of smacks us in the face with all of its glory that we see in the spring. And as a kind of exercise that we'll begin together now and just take a few minutes with, but I would like you to engage in a bit of reflection, if you can, over the course of the coming week, and maybe throughout the rest of this discussion series or Advent, if that season is meaningful to you, to kind of continue observing these signs of hope in nature around you, and also beginning to prepare and do the work of hope, as we've discussed it here. And so I have a particular prompt. So if everyone could pull out their 2 pieces of paper that I mentioned earlier, any 2 pieces with enough space to write a few words to yourself. And I'll give, it kind of has 2 parts, which is thus the 2 pieces of paper. So I'll do one at a time. We'll take a few minutes to do some initial personal reflection on it, and then I'll bring us back with a little bell, and then we'll do the second part for a few more minutes. Now, if you were at last Monday's session, you heard us mention that we'll be kind of progressively putting together a table or an altar, if you think of it that way, of gathered graces. And so the activity that we're going to do here is kind of about creating a couple of items to place on that table or that altar, to be signs of our own personal graces and our signs of hope as we move through this season ahead of us. So the activity for tonight and throughout this week, or maybe beyond, will be to spend as much or as little time as you want, kind of ruminating on this idea, recording at least one thing. And this could be an attitude, an idea, a habit, a relationship, but one thing on your first piece of paper that has shaped or characterized your life in the past year, but which you think might not serve you in the spring or the new year that's yet to come. And however you might choose to name these attitudes or ideas or relationships, think of this as your foliage whose autumn has arrived. We'll take a few minutes of quiet for each of us to reflect on that and begin to record some ideas. And I'll bring you back in a minute with the bell. Sorry to interrupt and call you back from reflection time. I know it was very short, and it's certainly only a start to a big question. But I hope that you've at least got some kernels to work from, continue to think on and develop further in the days to come. Because there's meant to be a very practical outcome to this kind of reflection. So think of how you might take some time after this particular session and go out and find one leaf for each of these pieces of foliage that you named on your paper, however many there may be, and place these leaves and your paper on what space in your home you're considering your table of graces. Hopefully something out of the way enough that you won't have to disturb it if that's possible for you, and where it can sit and be visible as a reminder to you of this ongoing meditation. And consider sitting with these leaves, these pieces of foliage, both literal leaves and this meaning that you're attributing to them now. And maybe you'll add to them over time. Maybe more will come to you. But throughout the remainder of the discussion series, find little moments to reflect on what it would mean in a practical sense, how it would actually look for you to shed those leaves, for you to relinquish them to the soil under your feet, let them be nourishment and joy elsewhere, let them contribute in a positive way to make peace, and let them go on to give life elsewhere. And it's a complicated thing, and each one of them will require a different process of relinquishing. So if you want to add some notes to your paper as you go along, or if you're a journaler, that can also be part of your table of graces. That's one feature for your new grace table. And now I'll offer guidance for the second piece of paper. On this one, I'll ask you to write down at least one bloom, one sprout, one flower that you hope to see in your own life come springtime, whatever springtime might be in life. It's not too far off in the distance, but it might feel far at the moment. And again, this can be an attitude, an idea, a habit, a relationship, something that you want to see that would kind of define the landscape of a better time, a healthier time, a joyful time. Kind of use this to paint the picture for yourself. What blooms are on your springtime landscape? And again, we'll take a few minutes to begin thinking about what that might be for each of us, and then I'll bring you back with a bell after a few minutes. once again, so sorry for calling you out of reflective space. As with the list of personal foliage, I will invite you to continue to spend time reflecting on what you've started here, jotting, kind of mapping out the landscape of your own personal spring, what blooms that it entails. And as with the foliage of what you're ready to leave in the year behind us, I hope that you'll spend time thinking about kind of the more practical details of the blooms on your landscape. And particularly, what do the bulbs that those blooms are going to arise from, what do the bulbs look like? What kind of practical planting and watering work or planting and rain do you need to give to them now in the present in order for that spring to arrive? What kind of hard work of hope do you need to put in now to allow for that future to be realized? How can we put in the winter to make the spring possible? If you would like to take this exercise to the next level, I would also very much encourage you, if it's at all possible for you, to actually go out and acquire at least one bulb for an early spring flower, which again, the easiest ones to find are crocuses, daffodils, and tulips. If you are able to go out and acquire at least one from somewhere, and then go plant it somewhere outdoors in the ground as soon as possible before the freeze sets in. That can be something that you can bear in mind throughout this coming season, is an ongoing work in the dark, in the cold earth. Something is growing and changing and happening, and that can be a reminder and encouragement to you as you in turn walk through the season, to also be doing that work, the underground, below the surface work, in order to make spring possible. And if you would love to have an actual bulb like that, but it's not possible for you for any reason, if you don't have access to any kind of outdoor space, then if you would like to send a message to me in the chat box, I have a very large number of bulbs and I would be happy to dedicate one to you and whatever your spring intentions may be, though you don't have to share them with me. But I will happily plant a bulb in your name in my own garden and then send a photo of it to you when it breaks ground in a few months. And if anybody can get a bulb but is a little uncertain or frightened of planting, if that's something that's new to you, I would also love to answer any questions that I possibly can to encourage that kind of practical symbol and reminder that can serve as another grace on our table, another reminder on our altar of things at work within us. And I think with that, we've about reached our time. And so before we go into a closing prayer, I'll just ask Mary Finlayson, oh, I'm sorry, no, Sheila, who's going to be doing next week's session on peace. Sheila, is there anything that you wanted to share about next week's session before we close?
Thank you, Teresa. I don't have anything to share this evening, but like Teresa, I will send something out to the whole list. So be on the watch out for something, and it will be, as Teresa said, on the theme of peace.
Great, thank you. So in that case, I will ask one more time, just to keep things fun and participatory. There are 3 slides that I'll show for our final reflection or prayer. So if I could just get 3 hands of folks who are willing to read the 3 slides for us. It'd be nice to have more voices in the mix. Okay, Maggie, Peggy, and Rachel, and we'll go in that order. So Maggie first, then Aunt Peggy, and then Rachel. And I will get that pulled up here. Okay. Unmute yourself and whenever you're ready. Oops, sorry, I went one too far. Okay, this is the first slide. So Maggie, go ahead.
Thanks, Teresa. When winter comes to a woman's soul, she withdraws into her inner self, her deepest spaces. She refuses all connection, refutes all arguments that she should engage in the world. She may say she is resting, but she is more than resting. She is creating a new universe within herself, examining and breaking old patterns, destroying what should not be revived, feeding in secret what needs to thrive.
Winter women are those who bring into the next cycle what should be saved. They are the deep conservators of knowledge and power. Not for nothing did ancient peoples honor the grandmother. In her calm deliberateness, she winters over our truth. She freezes out false-heartedness.
Look into her eyes, this winter woman. In their gray spaciousness, you can see the future. Look out of your own winter eyes. You too can see the future.
Thank everyone one more time for your presence. It's beautiful to connect with you in an unusual way, and to sometimes get uncomfortable and talk about new topics, and stretch our minds and try to see the world that we've been looking at for our whole lives in different ways. So I thank you all for being here. Thank you for sharing your hearts. And I hope that if you're able, you will join us again next Monday, and Sheila will lead a discussion for us on the theme of peace. But if we do not see you next Monday, we'd be very happy if you're able to join again later in the series, which will continue through the 21st of December, so the Monday before Christmas. And wish you all a very hopeful week or several weeks until we meet again. Good evening, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.